I've been doing a little bit of work on myself, trying to become the best person I can possibly be. And so, you can only go so far with self-reflection. Sometimes you need to get some confirmation from somebody else. So, would you say that I'm accommodating?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, I'd say so.
Oh, good. Thank you. Would you say that I'm basic?
Uh,
You're basic.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that I would say that you are,
Oh,
in a good way. Yeah,
thank you. Good. Am I calm?
yeah, you seem perfectly calm.
How about darling?
Yeah, yeah,
Just darling?
I'd say so.
Would you describe me as emblematic?
Sure. Yeah.
How about frisky? You don't need to answer that one. Grinning, human, innocent, jumping, kept, limited, meek, nap loving, etc., etc. I don't know. Like, I wish there was an organization where I could just focus on those particular skills, don't you?
Yeah, yeah, no, for sure. Now, I'm really interested. Do I seem xylophone to you?
You do seem very xylophone to me. Not
Thank
many
you.
people have got that trait, but you have got it to a key.
Awesome. Thank you. That is so great to
Yeah,
hear.
absolutely. Yeah, you've really got it. Now, let's zipper it and move on. Hello and welcome to Woeful Wednesdays. Nathan reads a series of unfortunate events. Ignore the tattoo. My name is Nathan.
And I'm Tyler.
If you did not catch that, that is the alphabet motto. Is that right? The alphabet pledge for the
Yeah,
Snow Scouts. I didn't want to
something
go
along
through
those
the entire
lines.
alphabet. I was already getting tired. I've read it enough times in the book, but
Oh, I know.
anyway, we are looking at Book the 10th, The Slippery Slope, and specifically at chapters 1 to 4. If you're new to this, we are reading through all of a series of unfortunate events. I'm reading the series for the first time. Tyler, you've read the series before as a middle grade reader, and then at least once, twice since then, something like that.
Yeah, once or twice. Yeah,
Yeah, so this is
since
at
then.
least your third time
Yeah.
reading through the series. Um, and we're producing one video a week. Each book is split up into 3 different videos, chapters 1 to 4, 5 to 8, and then 9 to 13. All right. So we will get into this one, and it's a longer book. I know they have been increasing in length, but there's a pretty big jump with this one. Maybe like 60 extra pages. It's like 350 pages, and I don't think we've had anything over 300. Maybe there was one book over 300.
Yeah, at the very least, it seems to be a fair bit longer. Yeah, uh, which is I appreciate, as long as they're not, filled with going up and down the stairs.
Are we gonna go up and down a mountain with this book?
I don't quite remember. I wouldn't say up and down a mountain, but
Okay.
something along those lines. But I don't think it's nearly as egregious.
Gotcha. All right. Well, we'll get into it, but before we do that, we need to say thank you to our good friends over at Snow Scouts. Snow Scouts. Here's what you want to do, parents. You want to send your children away to a cave in the mountains with one random middle-aged guy who insists that your children call him uncle. Have your children go away living like on the run members of Al Qaeda living in these caves in the mountain with some random dude. And if they refuse, if they say, I don't want to do this, just tell them it'll build character. Snow Scouts, enroll your children today.
There is no way that's a bad idea.
I don't
Nothing wrong with
I
that.
don't understand what's happening. All right, folks, I hope you enjoy. Ignore the tattoo! Nathan unfortunately reads a series of unfortunate events at an unfortunate age, which in this case is being used to indicate that he is entirely too old to be reading this for the first time. All right, so we are on book the 10th, The Slippery Slope, and specifically chapters 1 to 4. So I've got plot summary duty for this week, and then we'll get into our thoughts for it. So we pick up right where we left off with the end of book the 9th, where 2 of the Baudelaires, Klaus and Violet, are speeding down. I say speeding. They are going down the mountain for 10, 15 minutes without any sign of crashing in this caravan that was attached to Olaf's car, but he cuts it and he's got Sonny in the car with him and his troop, and they continue going up the mountain to go and find the headquarters of VFD, and Violet and Klaus have got a lot of time to chat and look at everything, that all the different objects in this caravan.
Yeah, it really undercuts the tension to just have them listing off all the different things that they can find.
That's exactly what I wrote in my notes. You can't pretend that this is suspenseful, but also have it go on and on and on. But anyway, they're able to avoid a collision. They don't crash into anything. That Violet is, through her thinking ponytail, is able to come up with a way of slowing them down using hammocks as essentially parachutes to slow it down, and then also just putting drag chutes, sure, as drag chutes, and then pouring any liquid, a mixture of liquids from the cupboards onto the wheels, which will somehow slow them down and not
sticky liquid.
Okay. But she didn't really, I guess she did make that distinction. But all right, so sticky liquids are going to then slow the wheels that way, and it works perfectly. Well, then she gets a table and then just like, I don't know, does a Schwarzenegger move, just holding it, just, hold on, like just holding this table outside of the speeding caravan to slow it down, and everything is perfectly fine. They don't get a scratch on them. They get out, but then the caravan ends up sliding over the edge of the cliff, and they are no longer able to turn it into some kind of car, because they were originally thinking of being able to fix this thing up to go after Olaf.
Yeah,
somehow.
I mean, hey, if Violet can make a roller coaster car engine work,
that's the thing. I was reading it, going, "Yep, that seems about right." So they anyway, but they can't do that. So they ultimately have just got the few items left from this, where they've got some articles of clothing and not much beyond that. And then they start hiking up the mountain, and you kind of get a pause in the story there, because then we jump into what's happening with Sonny, where no one in Olaf's troop seems to like Sonny, and they decide that they are going to camp for the night on their way to find the VFD headquarters. What is the place that they're looking for? I forget the name of it.
The headquarters of VFD?
Yeah, but there's a location nearby. Like,
oh yes, the Valley of the Four Drafts. I believe.
The Valley of the Four Drafts. So on their way to that, they decide that they're going to camp for the night. So Olaf decides that in these high mountains, the absolute best place to camp out for the night is on the summit of a mountain, and then getting Sonny to pitch a tent, or pitch two tents, and then she's going to sleep in a casserole dish in the trunk. That's basically what we've got going on with that storyline. And then we cut back to Violet and Klaus, who then end up in, I guess they had already ended up there, but they end up in this cave with the Snow Scouts, and Carmelita Spats is there with her uncle, who is in charge of like 20 plus kids, 15, 20 kids, something like that. This just seems like a lawsuit waiting to happen. This is not the right ratio of adults to children for supervision. I don't know what organization would allow for this kind of thing to happen, because there's usually legal requirements, but I'm assuming in this community,
right,
there are no such requirements. And
I guess no other adults wanted to face the snow gnats.
Yeah, I guess that's it. And all of the kids are wearing fencing masks. Mm-hmm. And one of them continues to say seemingly significant phrases that start with a V, an F, and then a D, and kind of looking at, Violet and Klaus knowingly, like, huh? Aren't we having a very fun day? huh? And they start to catch on, so they do the same thing to him. And then we leave off with him saying, Baudelaire's, I gotta talk to you. So who is this kid? I don't know, but he seems to know who they are, and it seems like he's on their side.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So before we hop into our notes, just curious, your thoughts on Carmelita Spats returning?
Strange. I was surprised. I did not expect to see her again. It was strange that she even got mentioned and that she seemed to be as significant as she was in the Austere Academy
Hmm.
because she had very little role in that. But Snicket spent a fair bit of time, or Handler, depending on how you want to view this, spent a fair bit of time talking about her
Hmm.
initially in the book, and then she didn't really play a role, or
Right.
she played a very, very small role. So I guess it kind of makes more sense now, where he
Yeah.
took some time to establish her character and then ignored her for most of the book and then has brought her back. Of the different characters that we've met, it's interesting that she has come back.
Hmm.
But I like it because she, unless something changes, she's essentially a bully who is their age, and
Hmm.
that's something that's something where most children can relate to that.
Right.
Most children don't, hopefully most children don't have a psychopathic adult who's murdering family members and coming after them. I don't think that's the experience of most children.
I guess not most of them.
Yeah, like less than 10%, right?
Right.
And most kids are not dealing with a crazy adult in their life, but most kids have definitely experienced bullying from a peer.
Yeah.
And I like the fact that in the midst of all of this stuff with Olaf, you also have got this jerk kid to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I was looking forward to getting to this book because I did remember that Carmelita Spats did come back, and
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah, I
makes
was
me
I was
happy.
definitely surprised.
Um,
All
all
right, so
right,
why don't you go first with chapter 1?
sure. And before we get to chapter one, just the dedication in this book. I don't know why, but this one in particular stood out to me. I really enjoyed it. For Beatrice, when we met, you were pretty and I was lonely. Now I am pretty lonely.
Seems like something you would like.
I don't know what that means, but I'll just move on.
I We've talked about it before where there's a lot of dad jokes
Oh,
in
yes.
these books, and that just seems like the only thing that's offensive about it is just how lame it is.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? That
Yeah.
it's not mean, it's not biting, it's not satirical. It's just a little bit of wordplay where most people just kind of roll their eyes. Okay, there we go, and you enjoy that. You like
Yep.
that kind of comedy. Like, I'm just saying, it's not a criticism. It's just you've pointed it out.
Yep. Um, all right. So in chapter one, on the very first page, just the way that Snicket has decided to start this book, or Daniel Handler, a man of my acquaintance once wrote a poem called "The Road Less Traveled," describing a journey he took through the woods along a path most travelers never used. So this is interesting, and I'm not sure if you have this marked as well.
I do.
Okay, because the poem that he seems to be referring to is The Road Not Taken
Hmm.
by Robert Frost. It is
Yes.
not titled The Road Less Traveled. There is at least one work that is written that is called The Road Less Traveled, but it is by M. Scott Peck, um, which is I'm not sure if he's trying to make some kind of reference to that. That is based largely on experiences Peck had as a psychiatrist and as a person. So I don't
Ah.
really think that that's what he's
Uh,
referring
no, I don't
to.
think so either. When did Peck write that?
Oh, that is a good question. 1978.
Oh, okay. because I'm assuming that it's such a Snicket thing to do that he's
To
sure that he's
intentionally get it just a little wrong.
I don't even know if it's intentional. It's just that he's
Right.
sure that he's getting it right, but it's a
Right,
little
yes.
off.
Sorry, should have clarified that Handler is intentionally getting it wrong
Exactly.
in the
But
voice of
Snicket
Snicket.
is unintentionally getting it wrong, but insisting
Yeah,
that he's getting it right. That it
yes.
definitely seems to be one of these things where he's suggesting that he's acquaintances with Robert Frost, which, no, just in terms of, I forget when Frost died, but I think, I'm kind of going out on a limb here, but I want to say 1960s.
Mm,
So
yeah.
we've talked about it before that he's friends with people who lived 200 years ago, 100 years ago, but also friends with Robert Frost. And
Right.
it's just obvious that like he's either just flat out lying to us, or him and all of these other writer acquaintances that he has, they're all vampires. They just
Yeah.
live forever.
Yeah. Honestly, either is just as likely in this series.
Exactly, exactly.
Yes. So the reference to Robert Frost, which I'm sure it is what he is
Look at me
meaning.
go. 63. He died in 1963.
Okay, good to know.
Got it.
I almost said awesome, and that is not
I
awesome.
know, I know. It's like, yay, he died. Wait, no, no, yay, I was accurate in when he died, which was a shame.
Yes. Um, so yes, going off of this point though, the road less traveled is what many people refer to Robert Frost's poem as. It is a very common error, and also most people seem to misinterpret the poem as well. Um, at least with the title being "The Road Not Taken," that is describing like that is the title of it. And so the story is really about, or the ending of the poem is two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. And so the interesting thing is that he's written this poem named after a road that he did not take, and is saying that has made all the difference, that I didn't take the more
Mhm,
well-traveled road.
mhm.
So I'm curious as to your thoughts on how relevant you think that is with the Baudelaires, um, because they certainly seem to be going down a path that is, at this point, less traveled,
Mhm.
um, and that they might regret that decision later.
Yes, regretting it later, perhaps. But I really like this idea of really thinking about how the poem applies to the Baudelaires, because at least for them, like, because what Frost is doing in the poem is you are right that he's titling it after the road that he did not take. And he's thinking about his life in regards to what it was not and not what it was.
Mhm.
And that the Baudelaires have essentially been doing this. They have idealized this vision of what their life should be and could be if only their parents had not died in a
Right.
fire. And that is, of course, the road more traveled, because most kids have parents.
Mm.
Most kids do not end up as orphans. And they're looking at that because they're now on the road less traveled, where they're out there independent on their own, going from one place to the other. But all that they can do is they can just constantly think, but if only our life was this. And
Yeah.
imagine what we would be doing at this point if we were on that road and not on this road. That ultimately they are right that they have been victimized by Olaf, because it seems that he's had something to do with the fire. But even if he hasn't, he's certainly victimized them since then. That they are right in the sense that they've been victimized, but that's also not a good way to live your life, because you ultimately can't fix that. You can only make the best of what your current circumstances are and try to improve things going forward. And mournfully, uh, looking at what could have been is psychologically not terribly healthy.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and I was, yeah, going to say, something similar to that, where it is just, you know, because yes, they are on the road less traveled in terms of, they are not growing up with their parents, and being on the run and all this, but they have also chosen, to do nefarious things, at this point repeatedly.
Mm.
And it is something that they have to deal with, that they have to live with those choices.
Yes.
And
Yes.
this idea of, well, what if we had done something different? Uh, because the way that, and many people do read the
Road not
Road Not
taken.
Taken. Many people do read that as, oh yeah, look at how great it is that I'm choosing to go a different way, which is not what the poem is actually describing. The poem is describing uh, regret of not taking the other
Yes.
road.
Yeah.
Um, and so again, then I think that it's something where it's like, well, maybe in the moment, then it seems like, okay, this might be, a good way to go
Hmm.
because not as many people have gone down here. And, even the Baudelaires have gone down the same road multiple times of, let's try to contact Mr. Poe, let's try to get the police on our side, all this, and it hasn't worked out time and time again. And now they are on this different path and finding out that maybe it was better to stick to the road that they knew that, so many people had gone on before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I agree.
Um, all right. Moving on then. Did you have anything else to add with that passage?
Um, I mean, it's interesting what Snicket is doing with it. Just that he, of course, misunderstands the poem, which
Yeah.
most people do. Uh, then he says, the issue with going down the road less traveled is that if anything happened on the road less traveled, the other travelers would be on the road more frequently traveled, and so couldn't hear him as he cried for help. Sure enough, that poet is now dead. Uh,
Right.
as though as though that had anything to do with it. Like he doesn't even
Right.
understand what poetry is, or he just misses it entirely. But in very much a Snicket way. So yeah, I don't really have anything to say. Just like it's a very good example of Snicket style writing.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So hopping over to page 12. Um, This is when Violet decides to no longer use the devil's tongue, which is a knot that has been very popular with her for quite some time, but has not given her much luck. Um, and instead, she is using the sumac, a knot I invented myself. I named it after a singer I admire. Now, did you look up this singer?
No, I was hoping you would. I looked at
Okay.
it and I didn't have my phone or my computer, so I was like, well, I hope Tyler looks that up.
Yes. So I believe it is pronounced Ima Sumac. Yma is the first name. Um, and yes, she was a Peruvian coloratura soprano. In the 1950s, she was one of the most famous exponents of exotica music.
Oh,
So,
okay.
exotica music was popular during the 1950s through 1960s with Americans who came of age during World War II. Um, yeah, this is where I actually found it very interesting, and this is all according to Wikipedia. The musical colloquialism exotica means tropical ersatz good, the non-native pseudo experience of insular Oceania, I don't know how to pronounce that, Southeast Asia, Hawaii, the Amazon basin, the Andes, the
Yeah.
Caribbean, and tribal Africa.
Okay.
So lots of stuff going on there.
Uh-huh.
The word that stood out there to me was ersatz good.
Yeah, I know. I definitely noticed that. So, not good?
Yeah, so apparently it is a substitute good. So
Okay.
it is especially one that is considered inferior to the good it replaces, which incidentally is how Lemony Snicket described ersatz
Yeah.
way back in the ersatz elevator.
Yeah, that's a really weird way to describe the music. Like that just seems like such a mean way a critic could describe
Right.
a type of music. Airset's good. It's not good, but if you don't have any good music on hand, then this'll do.
Yep.
It's so mean.
That's what Wikipedia has it listed as.
Yeah, I know. I wonder how long that'll stay. I wonder if something happened there. But
Right.
anyway.
Um, yeah, well, it says that AirSat's good. Sorry, I'm just gonna go off on this a little bit longer. Especially one that uh, an AirSat's good is a substitute good, especially one that is considered inferior to the good it replaces. It has particular connotations of wartime usage,
Right.
which is when Exotica, in the fallout of World War II.
Oh, okay. I see why they're using it that way because they're saying that for a lot of musicians were actually involved in the war. So then Americans then turned to music from various parts of the world where they were not involved in World War II and then said, what kind of music do you have? What kind of musicians do you have? Well, let's start listening to that since our most talented musicians are caught up in the war effort.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, that is really interesting. So it's another one of those references that seems like maybe it doesn't have that much relevance to the topic at hand. Why did Violet choose that particular singer to name this knot after? The only thing that I can think is that this this knot is an ersatz good of the
Yep.
devil's tongue.
Okay. That I think gives a lot of credit to Handler.
Yeah, it's a long walk.
I I'm far more suspecting that he just randomly picked it out, but
Yeah.
I could be wrong. I could be wrong. I think there it's one of those things where, short of somebody grilling him, going through the books and saying, "Why did you choose that? What does it mean?"
Yeah.
And that he could just perfectly explain all of these things. Short of doing that, I think it's impossible to know whether
Yeah.
he randomly chose these things or whether he had some kind of meaning behind it.
Yeah, I would absolutely love if he started watching our videos and started correcting us down in the comments. That would be amazing.
I mean, he would just be like every person on the internet, then randomly watch a video and then just wait until somebody says something you disagree with or is a little bit wrong.
Yes.
That's what the comment section is for, I think. By the way, folks, feel free to comment below.
Absolutely. Oh dear. Okay. So my next note is on page uh, 20 to 21. Um, oh dear, let me see where it was. Um, well, we do get this nice description, well, maybe not nice, but this interesting description of fate. Um, Fate is like a strange, unpopular restaurant filled with odd waiters who bring you things you never asked for and don't always like. It seems like another kind of, odd reference to the Airsats elevator and Cafe Salmonella.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So I'm not quite sure why he's making that connection there. Um, and then he starts describing what, you know, essentially relates back to the opening of this book and chapter, um, where he says when the book asked that their fate was to grow up in happiness and contentment with their parents in the Baudelaire mansion, but now both the mansion and their parents were gone. When they were attending Prufrock Preparatory School, they had thought that their fate was to graduate alongside their friends the Quagmires, but they hadn't seen the Academy or the two triplets in a very long time. And just moments ago, it had looked like Violet and Klaus's fate had been to fall off a peak or into a stream, but now they were alive and well, but far away from their sister and without a vehicle to help them find her again. So, kind of going off of again, now Snicket is describing everything that they are going through the lens of what they have not done,
Hmm.
what fate has not laid
Hmm.
out for them.
Hmm. Yes, absolutely. Did you have anything else you wanted to say in regards to fate?
Um, Not specifically, no.
Okay. Did you have anything else with chapter one?
Nope, that was it.
Okay, because I've got this section on fate marked as well, and it is a pretty good description of fate, but I think this whole discussion of it is interesting because you are right. That's an interesting connection that you're making to Cafe Salmonella, where it says fate is like a strange, unpopular restaurant filled with odd waiters who bring you things you never asked for and don't always like. That whole idea of you're getting these things that you didn't really ask for and you don't always like. Sometimes it's good,
Mhm.
sometimes it's just weird, and sometimes you don't like it at all. That I'm like, okay, as far as a shorthand metaphor for fate, that's pretty good.
Mhm.
But the whole discussion of fate is really interesting because this is something that has been debated and considered by philosophers and theologians for thousands of years of fate versus free will.
Yeah.
And it seems like within this book universe, this community that they live in, it seems as though at least Snicket seems to believe in fate, that various authors over time will employ fate in a book. I mean, like if you look at, let's say, Shakespeare with Romeo and Juliet, he begins immediately with the chorus that comes out and just says that they're two star-crossed lovers, as in there's
Yeah.
nothing they could do. It was in the stars that they were fated to have their love end in tragedy, that this was all meant to happen. And no, even when they do things where you say, well, that will avoid tragedy, then that just leads to tragedy. Going back to the Greeks with, prophecies and with the oracle and all of that.
Mhm.
But as far as, like, I mean, that's a huge debate, though, like
Right.
philosophically and theologically, whether fate exists or whether it's free will or random chance, and whether you can make some kind of compromise between the two positions. I don't really know what to say beyond that, but just, okay, so you're settling on the side of fate.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, it is interesting, considering how many times, he says things like, "Oh, if only I could go back and warn them," or, this, that, and the other. And so it's this idea of changing fate, which is,
Yeah, like because you're right. Because the way he does write in that way, it's very fatalistic. It's that
Mhm,
there's nothing that he can do, but he wants to do something to fix this. But it seems more like if it's fate and it is this fatalistic approach, it's even if he could go back and talk to the Baudelaires, it wouldn't do anything because
mhm.
fate would just rearrange itself, would rearrange events in such a way that things would still end tragically or disastrously for the Baudelaires, which seems to be essentially what's happening. Every time you think things are going to be okay, then it just gets reworked in a way that the tragedy deepens and continues in different odd ways.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely.
It's a trope of literature that goes back to the ancient Greeks, the idea of the fates. I
Hmm.
forget who it is who came up with it, but the three women with the spinning wheels, right?
Right. Yeah,
You know what I mean? The three fates, I think, is what they're called.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
y- I don't know if
That's
that's the Greeks or not, but
uh yeah, it is Greeks. And I'm trying to think of I believe that they have specific names. I don't remember if they are representative of past, present, and future.
I think so.
Yeah.
Uh, but in any case, I'm saying it's a trope of
Hmm.
literature, and it's interesting that he's invoking this trope.
Right.
That
Yeah.
just saying within this book universe, like because I'm saying if you look at somebody like Shakespeare, I don't think that Shakespeare necessarily was convinced that everything is written in the stars, it's all fate. But
Right.
for Romeo and Juliet, then that's what happens within Romeo and Juliet. So for that particular story universe, then fate exists, and you can
Yeah.
do that as a writer. You can say fate exists in this book, but not in this book. And so it
Hmm.
seems like that's what we have with these books. And I'm just like, okay, like I don't have an issue with it. It's just interesting that he brings it up.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. Uh,
And then the only other thing that I had with chapter one is just general comments as far as how long it takes for this, caravan to like not crash. And I wrote some cuss words, and then I just wrote, fine, this is TV time. It's utter BS, but fine. It's TV time, right? It's, like this thing's gonna blow in 10 seconds, and you like actually measure the time, and it's like 2 minutes of watching it. It's like all this time goes by, and it's like 8 seconds left, and all this time goes by, and it's like 6 seconds left, 5 seconds left. That's how it feels. Of if they're actually speeding down this mountain, they wouldn't have time to have conversations and look through the cupboards and her to put her hair up in a ponytail and invent something. But
it really just makes me think, why did Olaf wait until he was just about at the next turn before, cutting them loose? Why not wait until right after you did the turn and then release them? Then they'd have that long before they go flying off the cliff.
I guess he figured that it wouldn't pick up enough speed to damage it enough.
Well, but it flew off the edge and went down and shattered.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Anyway.
All right, let's move on to chapter 2. All right, I guess I'll go first with this one. I don't have much with this, but starting on page 29, I want you to read the sentence with that paragraph on the page towards the bottom. Read that full sentence, starting with Klaus.
Okay. Klaus was also thinking about the Quagmires, although he was thinking about when the Baudelaires first met them at Prufrock Preparatory School.
And I read that sentence I don't know how many times, and I finally just gave up and just wrote terrible syntax. That It is such a poorly constructed sentence, and it's so frustrating to have the words also and then although. Klaus was also thinking about the Quagmires, although he was thinking about when the Baudelaires first met them. When the Baudelaires first met them, like when he and Violet, or he and his siblings first met them, that the shift in point of view is changing. Klaus is thinking about this, although he was thinking when the Baudelaires, well, Klaus is the subject of this sentence, and now he becomes the indirect subject. And it's so poorly constructed, and I don't know that it's done for comedic effect. It feels like this is just terrible editing. I'm not even saying it's terrible writing, because I'm not blaming the writer, because certainly for a traditionally published book, there should be some serious professional editing that goes into this thing. And sometimes the writer just doesn't catch it, or just struggles with it, or doesn't realize just how clunky the syntax is. But in this case, like it bugged me enough that I made a note of it, because I read it multiple times before even understanding what it was saying.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think I did also have the same experience reading that. Because it's also interesting, the the structure of that sentence with the commas there.
Yeah.
Then it makes it seem like that is a subordinate clause that is unnecessary. And so then Klaus was also thinking about the Quagmires at Prufrock Preparatory School. So is he at Prufrock Preparatory School? Is he thinking about them when they were at Prufrock Preparatory School? So even that
it's still no part of this makes sense, because if you do read it that way, where you read the middle section as a subordinate clause, and you say Klaus was also thinking about the Quagmires at Prufrock Preparatory School. Okay, he was thinking about them there, although he was thinking about when the Baudelaires first met them. Well, they first met them. That's my cat's tail, by the way.
Yes.
But he first met them at Prufrock Preparatory School.
Right.
So what do you mean when he first met them, although he was thinking about them at Prufrock Preparatory School?
Yeah.
They were the same place. When he met them, that's where it was.
Right.
The more that's what I'm saying, is I'm just frustrated by it, because I look at it, and the more I look at it, the more I go, this is just poorly constructed.
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything more to say with it other than just it's surprising that that's in here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree.
All right, and then on page 35, so I just want to read this section. So starting with that paragraph at the bottom of 35, and we're going to go over to 36 with this. So starting with the last paragraph, the two Baudelaires looked up at the snow-covered peaks above them and felt a bit dizzy, not only from the height of the Mortmain Mountains, but from all the questions buzzing around their heads. Could they really reach the Valley of Four Draughts all by themselves? What would the headquarters look like? Would VFD be expecting the Baudelaires? Would Count Olaf have reached the headquarters ahead of them? Would they find Sonny? Would they find one of their parents? And then, like, it just, like, tune in next week, same bat time, same bat channel.
Right.
And what I wrote is, these questions are overt examples of narrative stalling.
Right.
There's nothing interesting happening, but reminding the reader interesting things might happen in the future, so you should keep reading. reminding readers, like, oh, there are interesting questions that will probably get resolved in these books. There's no signs of resolution coming anytime soon, but there will be.
Yeah, it's interesting because if you hop back to chapter 1 on page 20 to 21, actually the last sentence of the top paragraph on page 21, Lemony Snicket writes, "It seems that even after countless nights of battling snow gnats and praying the batteries would not run out, it is my fate that some of my questions will never be answered." This is kind of something that comes up a few times where, and has already come up a few times, where Lemony Snicket doesn't have all the answers. And I mean, I think that you're right that this is, narrative stalling.
Yes.
But I think that it's interesting that he is, phrasing so many different questions here that he might have been wondering himself, that Snicket might have been wondering himself at this time of writing it.
Fine. I feel like this is where Handler needs to edit his persona.
Right.
Of Snicket, because this is so frustrating to read. It's saying nothing interesting is happening. Like, I mean, could you imagine a book written with an effaced narrator where the narration, like, it's not an obvious character within the story who's narrating it, where the narrator just starts asking random questions like that to, like, remind, especially in a dull moment in the book where you have very little happening in terms of plot, and then to just say, but don't worry, there's all of these things that you should be thinking about. It's like, you don't need to tell me that I should be thinking about those things. If I'm asking myself those questions, the book is well written. If I'm not asking myself those questions, the book is poorly written. That this should be done intuitively. To overtly tell me as the reader the stuff that I should be thinking about as I read usually means I've forgotten it. And if I've forgotten it, it's you've failed as a narrator. So then to just kind of step out and just overtly say, remember these things. Mm-hmm. I don't know. It's at times I grow tired with the persona because it's excusing bad writing, I think.
Yeah. No, that is fair.
Yeah, at times. Not always, but I think that's an instance of it.
Yeah.
All right, that was all that I had with chapter 2.
All right. I only had one other note, which is on page 31. We get this interesting thing that happens when the Baudelaires are approaching the edge of the cliff, and Klaus says that he wants to say something to Violet, and then Violet says, don't say it, like, whatever it is, don't say it. And so on page 31, and we get this moment of Klaus, Violet said, when we were in the car, in the caravan, you said you wanted to tell me something before we tried the invention, but I didn't let you. What was it? I don't know, Klaus admitted. I just wanted to say something in case the invention didn't work. He sighed and looked up at the darkening sky. At that point, then I was just like, okay, sure, that can be like kind of a thing. But then when he says, I don't remember the last thing I said to Sonny, he said quietly, then that's when I went, okay, that's actually really effective.
Yes, I agree.
Where initially then I'm just like, all right, fine. You have your little moment of, oh, I want to tell my sister that, that I love her and everything. And that feels kind of clunky, but then when you realize, or are reminded that Sunny is that they don't know if they'll ever see Sunny again, and Klaus
Right.
doesn't know what the last words to her was, then that
Yes.
works really well.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
And that's my only other note for chapter 2.
Okay. Why don't you go first with chapter 3?
Sure. All right. First note here is on page 50. Um, let me see. So this is interesting. Uh, Toward the top of the page, it is always tedious when someone says that if you don't stop crying, they will give you something to cry about. Because if you are crying, then you already have something to cry about, and so there is no reason for them to give you anything additional to cry about. Thank you very much. Um, it's just, it's a fun little moment that definitely kids will appreciate.
Yes.
Kids
Yes.
who are reading it are going to be like, "Yeah, I hate when parents say that."
Yes, I agree.
Um, yeah, so that's my note there. And then on page 53, um, then we get this explanation of what exactly is going on with Olaf and the Snicket file and all of this, but it's still not very satisfying. It's still not very complete. I'll explain it, boss, said the hook-handed man. Count Olaf, like any good businessman, has committed a wide variety of crimes. But these stupid volunteers have gathered all sorts of evidence and filed it away, Esme said. I tried to explain that crime is very in right now, but apparently they weren't interested. Sunny wiped another tear from her eye and sighed. The youngest Baudelaire thought she'd almost rather be pinched again than hear any more of Esme Squaller's nonsense about what was in. Um, we need to destroy those files, or Count Olaf could be arrested, the hook-handed man said. We have reason to believe that some of the files are at VFD headquarters. And then, of course, they do get cut off. What does VFD stand for? And we get nothing.
Yep.
um, but yeah, so it is an interesting explanation, sort of what Count Olaf is doing here. Um,
Yeah.
it's interesting
But
because it's not a full explanation, that we still don't really get it.
that's where I'm saying that like Snicket has been stalling from a narrative
Mm,
standpoint throughout these books, that he knows what happens and what all the answers are to these questions, but he's not telling us, the reader. And I mean, this is at least more effective than going, why are they going to VFD
right.
headquarters? What are they going to find there? What's in the files? Will Olaf be able, like, that's like, at least it's done through the actual plot, through the
Mm,
actual story and dialogue. Um,
yeah,
but it is effectively the same thing. It's teasing you and teasing you and teasing you. There's significant things that will get revealed that when we arrive, and there are reasons why we're traveling, but none of those things are going to be answered right now.
right. Yeah, so I don't, I, it's interesting. I think that we like yeah there are all these questions that we want to have answered. Why is it called the Snicket file? We know that Lemony Snicket is writing these books,
Yes.
so why is it called the Snicket file if it's describing crimes that Olaf did,
Yeah.
and it is supposedly, describing Baudelaire Mansion? Like I don't understand any of this.
Yeah.
um yeah, so it's just odd.
I've since given up even trying to suss out the answers to this, because I just know that no matter how carefully I read it, I'm not going to find the answers, because he's just not going to tell us until like book 12 or 13.
Gotcha.
That's the problem if you construct a plot in this way, right?
Yeah,
If you construct a plot in a way where you tell if there's twists and turns in the story where the characters know everything there is to know, but then events actually change, then that's exciting. But if you just say, I know everything that's going to happen, I just won't tell you until the very end, then that's frustrating.
Right.
And that's the difference between an exciting and a frustrating story to read.
Mm.
And I feel like I don't know how kids can read this and not be frustrated by that.
Right. Uh, yeah, I mean, as someone who read this, like as the books were coming out, I was always wanting to read the next book in order to find out just the smallest extra detail.
Oh, okay. All right.
So it worked for me.
Sure. Yeah, that's fair.
Uh, yeah. All right, so my last note for this chapter is on page 61. And this is at the bottom of this page. Um, where is the baby going to stay? Asked the hook-handed man. I don't want her in my tent. I hear that babies can creep up and steal your breath while you're sleeping. And how appropriate that a cat has just hopped up in front of the
Yes.
camera. Um, because I'm not sure if you're aware or not, but there is an urban legend that says a cat will steal a baby's breath in its sleep.
Right. Yes.
So
Yes.
it's an odd kind of,
Right. You're gonna make
twist
this
on
as
that.
uncomfortable as possible, aren't you, buddy?
So it's an odd kind of twist on that urban legend that,
Yes.
clearly the hook-handed man has gotten it all wrong.
Yes.
The baby is stealing his breath instead of a cat stealing the baby's breath.
Right. Right. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, so that's my only other note there.
Okay.
I don't know what else to say about that other than just okay.
Yeah. No. It's such a the way they treat Sunny is very interesting. I honestly don't know what to make of it. They obviously are. It's all on the surface, They're not comfortable around infants. They don't treat her the way an infant should be treated. They're kind of creeped out by her, but at the same time have got high expectations of what she's capable of doing, like setting up the tents and you know what I mean. All of these things. They don't like the fact that they can't understand what she's saying. She's speaking some weird dialect or language they don't
Right.
understand. Like it's just she's a baby. You know what I mean? Like I don't.
Yep.
I don't know. It's all right there on the surface. I don't know if there's any deeper significance to it.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, just that one moment. It's such an odd reference that
Yes, it
I
is.
really appreciate because like I didn't know about that urban legend before and I literally had to look it up because I'm like, that's
Right.
so specific that there has to be something
Right.
there. And so I
Yes.
looked it up and then I'm like, oh, okay.
Right. Right. I don't know what's going on with this guy because he just keeps staring at me. Aside from the fact that he's been sleeping on this table for a while, which I was telling you before we started recording, he's very upset that I've stolen his spot. So he's going to get it back one way or the other.
Yep.
Uh, all right. So my notes for chapter 3. If you go to the very beginning of it on page 47,
Mhm.
then I'll just read from the beginning here. It says, "You may well wonder why there has been no account of Sunny Baudelaire in the first 2 chapters of this book, but there are several reasons why this is so." And then, he starts explaining it. So I just this is an interesting way of dealing with a shift in point of view because, and this is something that I know editors in publishing would point out, essentially, the way the books have been written up until this point is the 3 Baudelaires are pretty much always together. And that's the point of view that we have. It's a close point of view focused in on the 3 Baudelaires. We really don't get we don't get to see anything unless they are in the scene.
Right.
They don't really split up. We've seen them split up a couple times before, but when they split up, we lost track of the one who was somewhere else. So,
Right.
for instance, in the hostel hospital, then Violet gets taken away, and then she's put under sedation, and you've got Sunny and Klaus in the closet together. So then we don't get any more scenes. We don't know where Violet is
Mhm.
because the 3 of them aren't together anymore. So now we've got 2 of them together. So the point of view stays on those 2. And I know this because I've had an editor point it out in my work before, where they've said, if every chapter up until whatever point has always had this character in it and it's a close point of view, you can't then have a chapter with a different character. And I'm going, but it's not first person narration, it's third person narration. But then to say that it's a limited point of view focused in on a certain character, it's just a thing that editors pay attention to. And this seems to be a direct commentary on that, to say, okay, I know that I'm only allowed to tell the story if the three of them are together, or if they get split up, I can only tell the story with 2/3 of them. And the other one disappears. And then he's overtly coming out and saying, okay, we are going to talk about Sunny. Here's why I haven't talked about Sunny, and here's what's happening with Sunny, and then I'll come back to what's happening with Violet and Klaus. It's a very direct way of talking, of saying there's a shift in point of view here. Just pay attention, reader. I'm shifting the point of view for this chapter.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I hadn't made that connection to editors and the way that they do focus on that, but
I will never forget it after having those conversations. I will never forget that is something that editors will talk to you about as a writer, because you would say, like, it's not first person point of view, I can go wherever I want, and they'd say, but if you've essentially instructed the reader up until this point, you've given them the rules, even though you haven't said what the rules are. And the rules are that we're following this character, because if you notice, we never get stuff that's happening with Olaf on his own, or Olaf and Esme, but Snicket has come up with some clever ways in the last book where you find out what's going on inside Madame Lulu's tent, because the Baudelaires are listening in. So that's the point of view. Essentially, the camera is attached to them, if you're thinking in filmmaking terms. So then through their point of view, we're able to eavesdrop on Olaf and Esme, and Lulu and all of that. But we can't have a scene, we can't have a chapter with Olaf and Esme.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And then you're going, but Snicket he's not there. It's not first person, that he knows everything that's happened. Why can't we just have a chapter with them? And editors will say, because you can't, because you instructed the reader that you don't do that in these books.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. Of course, the eavesdropping issue was first, or discussion was first brought up with the reptile room toward the latter third of that.
Yeah.
And that is also an instance where Violet and Klaus split up to go do different tasks. And then we do follow each of them doing those tasks.
We do.
But they're looking at each other in many times, at many points. So,
Violet's looking through the windows to see what Klaus and Sunny are doing, and that's how he's able to get away with it. That once you understand that technical side of novel writing, then and really, like, it could be a short story as well, but it's chapter to chapter. And so that's why I'm saying novel writing. Once you understand that technical problem that writers face in how they set up the point of view, then you catch it a lot more. And then you go, oh, that's a clever way of dealing with it. And this is him just going, okay, I know I haven't been talking about Sunny, so I might as well say, remember Sunny? Like, I'll just be as overt as possible. Which I kind of appreciate, because I'm like, readers will figure it out. You could change the point of view. Like, that's my attitude, that like, they're not stupid. They'll know, okay, this chapter's focused on Olaf and Esme. That's different, but it's not baffling. It's not like, what is this thing? This is a book? How can this possibly be happening?
Did I miss something? Did I skip over?
Right. Yeah. So I don't know if he's maybe had that conversation with editors before, and then it's just kind of his, like, in some ways, a little jab at them of going, there, is that enough? Is that enough? Can I do it now? I like to think so, though.
Yes.
All right, then on page 50, I want to know if this is in your book, but at the very, very top of the page, just follow me here. I guess I'll read from the bottom of 49, starting with that last sentence where it says, it was true that she had been crying for most of the day, thorough out a long drive that even the most dedicated of researchers would be unable to trace. Does it say that in yours?
Yes, it does.
Okay, so I don't know. I'm assuming that we have the same edition. I'm also assuming that this is just a typo.
I'm hoping so.
Thorough out is not a word. I think he means throughout a long drive that even the most dedicated researchers. But the fact, and I don't see that being a joke, and the fact, like, it doesn't seem intentional. So it's not funny. It doesn't do anything. And there really are no spelling mistakes in the books. It seems obvious because even the conceit that we have of how these books are written, it's Snicket is writing directly to an editor, giving the manuscript to an editor who then is editing and then publishing these books. So even within that conceit, then there should still be a copy editor who would have caught that.
Right.
And I think part of the reason why I flagged it aside, because I mean, like, it happens when you publish a book. Sometimes then there's spelling errors, but it makes me wonder, because these books were published in such quick succession. And looking at that sentence that I pointed out before, where there's that awful syntax in it, that I wonder if just everything about these books was rushed.
Right.
That Handler was writing as quickly as possible and really faster than he should have been writing. And his editors were expecting these things to be written faster than that, and they were editing faster than they should have, and they didn't take enough time with copy editing. That's the only thing that I can think of. It's the most logical explanation for this, of why there's errors like this.
Yeah, I think that is quite likely. I, obviously can't confirm or deny that, but I think that is quite likely. I have noticed a few other issues here or there, like spelling errors in some of the previous books.
Yeah.
But nothing particularly egregious. And even this, then I think I probably just skipped over that one.
Yeah.
My mind just filled in the word that needed to be there. So
well, yeah, like obviously the editor and the copy editor, then that's what happened in their head too. And Snicket or Handler, that it's just it happens all the time. There are mistakes that show up in books, and even with multiple sets of eyes, typos still end up in the final copy of a book, which I don't think is anything. It's not a aha, we got you. It's just, it's more, I'm curious, is this a sign, is this evidence that these books really were published too quickly? Because we've talked about that before, where we go, it seems like he's really like filling space here. Seems like he didn't have much of a story here. Some of these chapters are much stronger than others, and you look at it and you go, was he really ready to write this book, or was he under contract to get 2 books published in a year, and it was just too much, so he did the best that he could, but he maybe wasn't happy with the end result.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, it is an interesting question. I'm curious about what other people think as well. Again, comment down below.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it is a good discussion to have, because we are pointing out a lot of things that that bother us or irk us in some way, and we want to have some kind of explanation for it. And if people can throw their ideas down below, then that would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think it bears repeating. I said it a few podcasts ago, but with middle grade, I think there's especially an incentive to quickly publish books in a series, because you're worried that the kids are going to age out of it. That you want to publish them really quickly in a series, because if a kid starts reading it when they're 10, but then you wait 4 years before you publish the next book, and they're now 14, they're probably not going to be interested in the series anymore. So I feel like that puts added pressure on middle grade and young adult writers that writers of adult series fiction just don't face.
Yeah.
I mean, like, you still face some pressure writing a series as like writing for an adult audience, but it's not the same kind of pressure.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's my suspicion. So I'm not, it's not a criticism. It's just kind of one of those things of like, if you're writing to a middle grade audience, there just is a certain amount of, you're going to have to churn them out. Yeah. All right. Page 64 is my last note for this chapter. And so, I guess actually I'll go from the bottom of 63 with that paragraph at the very bottom of it. It says, It is quite often frustrating to arrange all the cloth and the poles so that a tent works correctly, which is why I have always preferred to stay in hotels or rented castles, which also have the added attractions of solid walls and maid service. And then he continues on, but Sonny's trying to set up the tent. And I just wrote down, like, quelle surprise. Snicket doesn't appreciate camping, you know?
Right.
Like, is that any surprise at all? For like, he's so disparaging towards anything to do with outdoor athletics and sports and exercise, and camping is definitely not as comfortable as 21st century accommodations. Like, yes, you're right.
17th century accommodations,
Sure,
according to the castle.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that obviously camping is not as comfortable and it is lots of work and all of these things, but there's an appeal. But like all of these things, like exercise and sports and outdoor activities, he just is constantly disparaging them. He seems like, and I'm saying not Handler, but I'm speaking to Snicket as a persona, just seems like somebody who is very comfortable being in an indoor environment, climate controlled with all of those things, and lots of food, because he mentions food all the time, and
right.
Anything that's hard work, like hard physical activity or labor, avoid. And there's strange lessons to teach to children, because children, like, that's usually when you start camping, is when you're in Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, and summer camp and stuff like that. It's usually you learn it from
confused with the Snow Scouts.
Right, the Snow Scouts. But summer camp, and you learn it at a young age, and I don't know. It's just interesting that he's disparaging towards it.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's a good point.
All right. Chapter 4. Why don't you go first?
Sure. All right. My first note here is on. Oh dear, my notes have sneaked back into the book. All right. I believe my first note here is on page 79. Yeah, this is where we start to get into the. Okay, there's this whole discussion of the bears. I don't quite know what's going on with the bears.
I don't know either.
And then we get into the lions. Lions lived in these caves, and they weren't soldiers. The lions were detectives, volunteer feline detectives. Okay, so that's really interesting. Volunteer feline detectives, of course, is VFD. But the fact that the lions, which were present in the previous book, are those the same lions? And is this connected to VFD? Did VFD bring these lions up to these caves and train them? And then Count Olaf just stole them?
Okay, I'll go with it. I didn't make that connection at all. I thought it was just this kid trying to come up with some contrived way of saying VFD.
Right. Yeah, I know. It's and it could be, but I do think that it's quite possibly, volunteer feline detectives could have been what VFD called these lions. So, yeah, I don't know.
It could be.
That's that one note. And then, yeah, I only have one other note here, which is on page 82. Yeah, so I'm just going to read the largest paragraph here. Well, it wouldn't be very accommodating to say so, Bruce said, but I must admit that the story you were telling was a little dull, kids. When Snow Scouts tell stories, they skip everything boring and only tell the interesting part. That way, the story can be as basic, calm, darling, emblematic, frisky, blah, 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 as possible. So we are once again getting this idea of, these messages hidden in the boring parts of the story. And that's kind of what we had discussed before with these books
Hmm.
being potentially all a cover for this exchanging of secret messages. And so it could just be, more lampshading. It could be once again teaching kids, hey, don't just read, the interesting parts, or don't read the
Yes.
summaries, but
Yes.
the synopses, but also actually read all the boring parts because you'll find a lot more in them that way.
Hmm.
So yeah, I'm not sure. Which way do you think that that's leaning, or is
Um,
it both?
I mean, I think it is some some lamp shading in there. It's essentially saying, like, because he says when Snow Scouts tell stories, they skip everything boring and only tell the interesting parts. That way, the story can be as accommodating, basic, calm, et cetera, as possible. And uh, I mean, I feel like it is a way of proactively going after critics or responding to critics, like preemptively responding to critics and saying, I don't mean like formal literary critics, but kids who maybe say, well, this was kind of boring or that chapter went on too long. And then, um, I don't know, essentially saying, you need to have some boring parts in a book that not everything can be super interesting and exciting all the time, because if you never have any boring passages at all, then it ends up like what Carmelita Spats thinks is a good story. She says, I'll show these cake sniffers how to tell an interesting story. Once upon a time, I woke up and looked in the mirror, and there I saw the prettiest, smartest, most darling girl in the whole wide world. I put on a lovely pink dress. That this idea of, I don't know, that I guess my point would be most writers, when they do a first draft, think everything in there is interesting, but they don't always know how to identify the boring from the interesting stuff. And
Right.
you typically are relying on an editor. And then from there, if you stripped it down to what some readers would want, where some readers would say, that part's boring, that part's boring, that part's boring. And then if you remove those parts, then the story probably wouldn't work as well. That I guess I'm saying that to criticize an author and to say that part's boring, that part's boring, and that part's boring, they should be removed, that might ruin the book in some ways. That
Hmm.
sometimes there are boring elements to a book that are also incredibly functional.
Right.
And I genuinely don't know, because I've got that passage marked as well.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, I kind of facetiously have got my little comment here of, that like always like you should skip everything boring and only tell the interesting parts. And I wrote, someone should tell that to Lemony Snicket.
Right.
Um, but
Yeah.
he does this intentionally. He
Yeah.
includes boring passages, and he's actually doing something interesting even with those boring passages. Sometimes
Hmm.
he's embedding little clues about what's going on to the reader with the actual events affecting the Baudelaires, but also it seems to be that there's some embedded messages that he's sneaking into the story to speak to his sister, which is interesting as well. And then the only way that you can embed or encode something is by disguising it with a bunch of seemingly boring stuff. But if
Hmm.
you create suspicious readers who believe that there might be more to the boring passages than you initially think, then that gets them to carefully read even boring passages, which makes the boring passages interesting.
Right. Yeah.
And I guess that's my point, is that it's hard to like, who is the arbiter of what is boring and what is interesting, and that ultimately it depends on the reader, because there are
Right.
plenty of books where somebody will look at it and say that entire book looks really boring and I read it and I was so bored, and somebody else will say I read the entire thing and I found it so interesting. And that's
Hmm.
why I feel like when I think it's bad critics on YouTube who really have no formal um, training in how to be a critic. Not that there's necessarily a way to get trained, but certainly there are university programs which can help with that.
Hmm.
But and to just kind of discipline yourself over the years. But I think that bad criticism is, I thought it was boring. I found it boring, or it was boring. Usually my response to that is, It's boring because you're boring, because you don't know what's interesting about it, right? That
Mm.
only boring people get bored, that kind of
Right.
idea of,
Yeah.
but I also think that that's not a fair criticism, because somebody else can say, I found it interesting, or I found it exciting,
Mhm.
I found it boring. And now you've just got two subjective opinions arguing, and nobody can prove one way or the other whether it's actually, in fact, boring or interesting.
Yeah.
And it's just, I think that that's an interesting like thing to bring up in these books, to
Yeah.
say skip all of the boring parts and only have the interesting parts. And I guess my point is, yeah, that's kind of what every writer is trying to do all the time, but it's very hard to know how to do that. And
Right.
even if you think that you've done it perfectly, you're going to have many readers who will tell you that you didn't. And you're going to have
Hmm.
many readers who will tell you that they wanted more and that you skipped over interesting stuff that you didn't include.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, because there's basically two different avenues that you can go down there, where one is remove all the boring parts and only leave the interesting parts. And the other is make the boring parts interesting,
Sure.
uh, which is what Lemony Snicket has attempted to do over and over again.
Yes,
Um,
agreed.
so it's yeah, so it is interesting to uh, bring up sort of those two different options. And I guess a lot of me is looking at this and thinking about, like Sparks Notes, or any
Yes.
site like that,
Yeah.
where they just give you the bare bones parts of it, including, oh yeah, this is the most interesting theme of the book.
Yep.
Like it can do that. I don't know. I never really used it myself, but I know that lots of kids do, and this is kind of encouraging you. No, you should read the whole thing, and you might find extra little things that aren't going to be found in the summary.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. If you just go to a synopsis, like something like Spark Notes or Cole's Notes, then
Right.
absolutely you're gonna miss stuff. I mean, as far as critical reading skills and doing a close analysis of something, which is specifically what you get trained to do in an English program, then you are trained to look for the parts of a book that stick out.
Hmm.
Uh, that is effectively what I'm doing when I'm going through these books. Whenever I'm,
Right.
doing literary criticism, then effectively what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, so 98% of the book, it's all right there, it's all on the surface. But look
Hmm.
at this interesting, odd little thing over here that is out of sync, it's out of step with the rest of the book. Like
Yeah.
even what we see with chapter 3, that little description that he has at the beginning of, like, oh, you're probably wondering why we haven't heard from Sonny, and then he gets into this whole thing that I'm going, but look at what happens though when you understand that. Then you say this is actually a commentary on the entire series, on the point of view of the entire series, that it seems like boring, like this
Right.
unnecessary thing. Just start in by saying what's happening with Sonny. Why do you have to have that? But for some readers, that's actually incredibly interesting.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so, and to me, that part sticks out. It doesn't fit with the rest of what we've seen.
Right.
And that's what you're trained to do, is to look for those little things that don't quite match what you've seen in the rest of the text. And yeah, so that's why the whole discussion there, it, it's going far beyond this series.
Right.
like
Yes.
and I really appreciated that he's not offering really any like solutions to it. I guess it's just
Mhm.
more presenting the question of saying, well, obviously a writer wants to only include the interesting parts,
Right.
but ultimately there is no answer to that. That is an impossible task.
Mhm.
That, you know, I mean, just speaking personally, I've had people say that they found my debut novel Orphans of Liberty, they found it too short, that they wanted more, they wanted longer action sequences, and they wanted, more background information. And then I've had other people say the background information was too much and I didn't need all of that. And you know what I mean, like
Yeah.
that there were too many action sequences. And then I'm going, like, so I get criticized on both ends, right? That
Yeah.
it's too much and not enough. And that's, I think, the point though, is it's a subjective thing to say what's boring and what's interesting, and to
Yeah.
act as though there's just this objective way of identifying interesting, boring, interesting, boring, and then you just sift out the two, and then you only include interesting.
Right.
It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because what Carmelita Spats finds interesting is herself.
Yes. And it's such a childish attitude to say, I only want interesting stuff. So that's why I'm saying when
Yes.
somebody criticizes a book or a movie and they say, well, that part was boring, it's like, it was boring to you, but you're only one person. So if you think that that's a criticism of the film, it's not. That's just your own subjective reaction to it. But that's not helpful to anybody else because nobody else is exactly like you. So part of criticism is trying to think not just as an individual, but to think how other individuals would potentially respond to this.
Yeah, no, that's yeah, absolutely. All right. So those were my notes for chapters 1 to 4.
Yeah, and we covered what I had to say with chapter 4 as well.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, so moving on, I suppose we will likely find out who this mysterious snow scout is. And yeah, hopefully Sunny will not be required to sleep in a casserole dish for much longer.
Agreed.
I don't even know what else to say there.
I think the shape of a casserole dish might be kind of nice, but like it would be too tough. You know what I mean? If it was maybe like in the shape of a casserole dish, but it was all cushioned, that'd maybe be a comfortable place to sleep.
Sure.
Like, like pet beds, for dogs or cats, or there's just a big pillow, but it's in like kind of the shape of a casserole dish. But an actual casserole dish, that porcelain under you and as a pillow, sounds awful. Poor little kid. But yeah, I know. I don't know who this Snow Scout is, and yeah, definitely issues with Sunny and the casserole dish. So we'll have to keep reading to find out what happens next, because I don't know.
Yes, and of course, read along with us, including the boring parts, so that you can also pick out what the interesting parts are.
That's right. Watch along with us with the podcast, including the boring parts, because we don't know what the interesting stuff is and what the boring stuff is. It's all interesting to us, but we're just subjective individuals when we're talking here. So
absolutely. And if we skip over any interesting parts in the series, let us know what you found interesting that we skipped over. I don't know. There's got to be something.
There does. Absolutely. All right, folks. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.
Ignore the tattoo! A phrase here which means like, comment, subscribe, and share this podcast across the web. That may seem like a strange definition, but in this context, it is entirely accurate.